Hello and welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. I continue, no matter how they keep trying to fire me after every segment, but no, I continue to be your host. I don't know. Does that mean they would change the name from Around the World to XXX? Who knows? Anyway, we're very honored to have with us today Thomas Munson, who's a journalist from the UK. Welcome, Thomas. How are you this morning?
I'm very happy to be back on the show, Dane.
Listen, it's always an honor. And so let's just get started here. We have a lot to talk about that you're there in the UK. I don't know where to be. Let me start here. There's this conversation. As we all know, the world is in a really difficult place. And we talk about what America's doing, what China's doing, what Russia's doing, what the EU is doing. In the old days, when we would talk about the EU, that would encompass the UK. But the UK is kind of just a little standalone. Listen, I love the UK. I spend most of my time there. But the UK now is just a little standalone island, and really can't, where does it fit? And where does it fit in the world these days? It's not really, I can't say it's a American ally because things are a little strained, but who knows? And it doesn't really fit into the EU. But talk to us does the UK need to kind of go back to the EU?
Yeah, I think there are sort of two competing realities. I think when politicians were advocating for leaving the European Union, there was quite a strong vision for a global Britain. The UK being quite uniquely placed actually to be a bridge to many different parts of the world. Of course, you still have the Commonwealth and the Anglosphere and Five Eyes, and I think there was certainly a vision that the UK could be a bridge between the EU and the US, and in that sort of way. And the reality, I think, since we voted to leave the EU, is actually something very different. As you said, I think we look somewhat isolated now. I know that people like Boris Johnson and Keir Starmer now have been very prominent when it comes to securing funding for Ukraine and the defense against the Russian invasion. But actually, if you're the US and you want to have a serious conversation about European security, your first phone call is not going to be to Keir Starmer. It would be to somebody like Emmanuel Macron, Merz in Germany. And so, in that sense, leaving the European Union has definitely diminished the UK's ability to lead on the world stage. And I think you're right when you say that really, the UK has to almost accept the fact that it's just a sort of relatively mid-sized island economy off the coast of a major power. And I think it's going to take a long time for Britain to come to accept that.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, well, listen, what makes UK more than just an island, as we all know, is the fact that it does have nuclear weapons, and I
Yeah.
think that kind of, gives it a little bit more clout than, I mean, honestly, I would think that if it wasn't for its military nuclear capabilities, that, it probably would be even lesser down the food chain, as they say. But let's take a very specific example about, Greenland. Greenland, let me back up. The UK is part of NATO, right? Still part of
Mhm.
NATO and will continue to be part of a key cornerstone to NATO, founding member of NATO. But Greenland, for example, as we all know, ever since Trump decided to, take Maduro in the middle of the night from Venezuela, he feels more emboldened about taking Greenland by whatever means, as he says, not my words, by whatever means are necessary. But where does that put the UK? I mean, first of all, I'd be interested is what do most Brits feel compelled to protect Greenland? That's A. And B, if there was, a military action against Greenland to take it, it's part of the EU, whereas, the UK isn't. I mean, help us walk us through that scenario.
Yeah, I think just quickly before we address that on the nuclear weapons thing, not that long ago, the UK we tested our nuclear weapons and we failed to launch the test missile that we were going to launch. So I'm not actually convinced that if we wanted to fire a nuclear weapon that we'd be able to, which is quite concerning. But in terms of the mood on Greenland,
Oh, by the way,
um,
Putin, don't listen to that statement, okay, Putin. Vladimir, don't listen to what he just said, okay? So,
yeah, if anybody from the FSB is listening, just pretend I didn't say that. In terms of the mood on Greenland, I think really it sort of compounds this growing anti-American sentiment, I would say, amongst the population in the UK. I think there's a quite strong sense of betrayal that our closest ally would consider invading an autonomous region that belonged to another democratic ally of ours. And I think that if America did try to annex Greenland, I think we'd go back to sort of transatlantic relations we've not seen since before World War II. I mean, there'd be a massive reset in that regard. But in practical terms, on your second question, what would the UK actually do in such a scenario? Without wanting to sound too pessimistic, I'm not really sure that the UK could/would do very much at all. I mean, the UK in reality is borderline a satellite state of the United States in real terms. If you want to look at our military hardware, a lot of it has American components, or it's just American made anyway. If you look at our banking system, our financial system, we use American digital infrastructure to operate that. So the idea that the UK would be able to kind of come to Greenland's aid in any kind of military sense is not realistic, unfortunately. What Keir Starmer has said is that he wouldn't allow UK air bases to be used by the US in attacking Greenland, which I think is really kind of the bare minimum that you can say. It's like, okay, we're not going to stop you, but you can't use our air bases. So I wouldn't be relying on the UK to come to Greenland's aid at this time, I'm afraid.
Well, it's sad. I mean, when you think about, one thing we talk a lot about in the show is that the importance of freedom and democracy, and I always put this caveat out there. Listen, I'm a proud American. I love America. I love my country. But we have, for the first time in my generation, honestly, a president of the United States that does not talk about the importance of protecting freedom and democracy. He's a very transactional president. Some people think it's a good thing. Some people don't. My next guest after you will be having that conversation. But the reality is, if we talk about the protector of freedom and democracy around the world, I mean, the UK, honestly, is really one of the key defenders of that. And so let's just go to another part of the world. Let's talk about what's happening in Iran, where all the protest is happening there, and the importance of protecting freedom and democracy. And I mean, where does the UK stand on what's happening in Iran these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, from a sort of more geopolitical point of view, it's very much in the UK's interest for there to be regime change in Iran. You've had something like 20 foiled terrorist plots in the UK in the last couple of years that have all linked back to either Iran directly or Iranian-funded organizations. I think that the UK would definitely support the US in some kind of action if the US was looking at taking action. Although that may look something more like logistical support or supporting with intelligence in some way, as opposed to like direct military involvement alongside the US to topple the regime. I mean, in the UK, actually, we're sort of talking about the UK's maybe diminished role in the world at the moment. They do have a particularly unique role with Iran, where a couple of years ago, as you'll know, the United States prescribed the IRGC, which has led to a sort of complete breakdown in diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran, of the current regime anyway. And so during that time, the UK has actually served as something as a conduit between the United States and Iran when it comes to diplomatic relations. And, when we look when the United States has acted in the Middle East, the UK has often provided some kind of support as well, whether it's logistic or the contribution of fighter jets in airstrikes against Iranian-backed terrorist groups such as the Houthis.
Well, it was interesting the other day, which you rarely, like, let's take the Middle East as a whole. I mean, usually the United States leads most of the major assaults there, but it was interesting. I saw the other day, which did not get a lot of play, is that how the Brits and France actually had they attacked some ISIS targets in Syria alone without the U.S. involvement. I mean, that's unusual, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is fairly unusual. But then, as you say, the UK, alongside the US, has always been pretty heavily involved in the Middle East as well. Obviously, there's an old colonial link with that region. Um, but then if you look at some of the recent conflicts that have taken place in the Middle East as well, take Afghanistan, for example, um, as a percentage of our population, we had roughly the same amount of casualties in the UK as the United States. Was actually a stat that I saw shared recently when Trump commented that he didn't think that NATO would ever be there for America. It's like, well, actually, a lot of NATO countries have had a lot of casualties following the United States into wars where the United States felt like it was under attack. So I think, along with Trump's recent Greenland comments like that really sort of sow the seeds of doubt about the future of any serious US European security relationship.
Well, so let's talk about let's go back to this whole thing about the EU and reunification and
Mm.
democracy and freedom. I mean, you have let's just say let's just argue in my mind. I firmly believe that America has abandoned its responsibility, global responsibilities when it comes to protecting freedom and democracy or standing for freedom and democracy. I just fundamentally believe that. So, in absence of that, who's going to stand up now? I do think that, as you rightly pointed out, I mean, the UK has done a phenomenal job of raising funds for Ukraine and has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine. To me, I would argue that they're almost as done as much, if not more, than the EU as far as just rhetoric is concerned, if nothing else. But do you think if America continues this downward spiral of not protecting freedom and democracy, does it fall to the UK to kind of lead more on that subject?
Yes, I think as a matter of fact it does. I think that while we're going through this difficult period as a country, as I said, we left the European Union in 2019, and that has certainly diminished our ability to be able to lead in that sense. I think when I was talking about global Britain earlier, or vision for global Britain earlier, I still think all of those things that led that vision are still true, or certainly still possible. I think there isn't another country in the world that's got the same links that we have, whether it's our relationship with India. And I think India is actually going to be an increasingly important power, of course, going forward. Our relationship, the Five Eyes relationship, and our history generally. You're talking about freedom, human rights, Britain leading. Of course, it was Britain that led on abolishing slavery ultimately. And so I definitely think there's a place for us to do that. But I think it would have to be in tandem with the EU, not necessarily as a member of. I'm not sure how practical it would be that we ever return to the European Union, but certainly working closely with those partners. I do think the onus is on the UK and the EU to pick up the mantle, as it were, in the absence of American leadership.
Well, let's talk about as you said, the possibility, which you find remote, of rejoining the EU. As it stands now, I mean, Keir Starmer seems to be taking some action, if not legally, to become a new member, regain membership of the EU, but definitely building a better relationship with the EU. But the Labour Party definitely is not doing well. The Conservative Party or the Tories clearly aren't doing well. And if we fast forward, as we've talked about before, to the next election, pretty much all the odds makers are saying that reform will kind of honestly take over the leadership of the country, which is run by Nigel Farage. But let's talk a second about there was a major defection yesterday from the Tories to somebody, by somebody that we mutually know. Talk to us about Nadeem Zahawi and what happened.
Yeah. Just so your listeners, your viewers are aware, I worked for Nadeem Zahawi for 2 years. So I started working with him when he was the vaccines minister at the time. So during COVID, he was the minister responsible for vaccine deployment. And I think that particular ministerial role is probably amongst the British public the thing that he's most synonymous with. It was a rare success story when it comes to government programs. And so he's always maintained a relatively good reputation off the back of that. Later on in his political career, he did run into some difficulties where there was some confusion about his tax affairs, and then that ultimately led to him leaving the government at the time. Nadeem's moved to reform. I think that in real terms, like Nadeem can actually offer reform a tremendous amount. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Um, but in terms of optics, I think politically, maybe not the best move for reform. This is somebody who was heavily involved with the last government. He served under Liz Truss, who famously was only in power for a few weeks. Very heavily involved with Boris Johnson's government as well, served under Rishi Sunak. And so, if you're talking politically in terms of optics, taking on somebody like Nadeem makes it harder for Farage to seriously challenge the work of that previous Conservative government because somebody who was central to the work of that government is now part of his team. But why do I think that it was good for Reform to take Nadeem on? I've seen firsthand, first of all, absolutely phenomenal leader. He can run a department brilliantly. He gets the best out of people. And if he can bring any of that to the sort of back room to Reform, then Reform's going to see some serious improvement. But also, Nadeem Zahawi, a lot of people don't realize he's a very successful businessman. His net worth over £100 million, I think. And so he's got those business links. And, it's quite possible that those business links will end up helping fund reform. So a serious scalp. And I think certainly the biggest defection that we've seen so far.
Yeah, sadly, we just have like one quick minute here. I mean, listen, is Nadeem leaving? I have tremendous respect for Nadeem, but this just to sum it up, if reform does win in the next election, with people like Nadeem, I mean, what do you think? Do you think that that bodes that well for reintegration possible with the EU, or you think it's going to build a bigger divide between the EU and the UK?
It would inevitably lead to a much bigger divide. Nigel Farage is very much a toxic figure within the EU. Of course, many European politicians will remember when he was a serving member of the European Parliament and was a constant thorn in their side. There have been concerns before as well that Farage has sort of parroted Kremlin talking points in the European Parliament as well.
Yeah.
And so and that would inevitably lead us to move further away from Europe, but probably closer to the US. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out.
Yeah, closer definitely because he and Trump are very similar in so many ways, and definitely closer to the U.S., which I think is to a detriment to the world in many ways. And so, listen, UK, what the world needs to understand is that the UK is a very critical component to global security and freedom and democracy. So, listen, Thomas, I really appreciate you being with us today. It's always a great pleasure, and giving us your thoughts because the UK is just something we just need it's a bellwether country as well. Even though it's small, it definitely has an impact on where the rest of the world is going. So anyway, thanks for all your good work and thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me back on.